My name is Stephanie, and I learned long ago that people only respect power if they fear losing something they love. For me, that something was my research 12 years of genetic studies. Experiments, sleepless nights, and unshakable belief that my work could change the future. That day in my lab in Boston, I was preparing to run a final sequencing test on a genome I'd been mapping for months. Every light on the machines blinked in quiet harmony. The hum of the centrifuge was steady, and my hands were steady too until the door slammed open. My mother burst in without knocking. She looked like she had come straight from some self-righteous sermon. Her pearl necklace swinging against her collarbone, eyes blazing with the fury of a woman who thought she had the right to destroy. Before I could even ask why she was there, she crossed the room in sharp, purposeful steps, grabbed the stack of leather-bound journals from my desk, and began tearing the pages out with an animal ferocity. "Your brother deserves grandfather's estate more than you!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the machines. Bits of paper fluttered to the floor, each one carrying months of my handwriting, sketches, and data. I didn't move at first. My body wanted to lunge forward, to wrench the journals from her hands. But my mind locked into the cold, surgical focus that had gotten me through every betrayal of my life. I watched her tear apart my work, cataloging each rip of paper, each crumpled page like evidence in a crime scene. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I finally asked, my voice low enough to make her glance up. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she hissed, tossing the remains onto the floor. "You've always thought you were smarter, better than the rest of us. Well, intelligence won't buy loyalty. Your brother has stood by this family. You haven't." It took every ounce of willpower not to smile at the irony. My so-called brother, Ethan, had never stood by anything in his life. He was a parasite in designer suits, feeding off the family name and draining money faster than our father could funnel it to him. "Get out," I said, not raising my voice but sharpening it like a blade. For a second, she looked startled, but then she smirked because in her mind she had won. She'd ruined my research. She'd wounded me. But she didn't understand something fundamental. I had built safeguards long before she ever stepped into that lab. She didn't know about the digital backups encrypted in 3 separate cloud vaults. She didn't know about the physical duplicates stored in a safe deposit box in New York City, paid for in cash so no one could trace it. And she certainly didn't know that the destruction she thought she'd caused was nothing more than a spark to ignite the fire I'd been waiting to unleash. That night, I stayed in the lab until dawn, gathering the shredded remains and placing them in an archival box. Not because I needed them, but because I wanted them as a reminder, a relic of the moment my mother declared war on me. The war escalated quickly. 2 days later, I received an invitation more like a summons to a family meeting at our old Georgian-style house in Savannah. The house was an inheritance from my grandfather, a monument to old Southern wealth with its white columns, sprawling veranda, and a study filled with polished mahogany. Walking up the stone path, I felt the air thick with the scent of magnolia and resentment. Inside, my parents sat on opposite ends of a leather couch, their postures stiff. Ethan was there too, leaning back in an armchair like he already owned the place, legs crossed, one ankle showing off an absurdly expensive Italian leather shoe. On the coffee table sat a manila folder with the Hastings and Cole Legal logo printed in gold. The family lair, a gaunt man named Thomas Reeve, cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming, Stephanie. We're here today to settle the matter of Arthur Hastings's estate." My father nodded, looking almost eager, as if this meeting would be the final confirmation that their golden boy was entitled to everything. My mother's eyes darted toward me, smug and expectant. Reeve adjusted his glasses, opened the folder, and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "Before we proceed, I must share the results of a DNA test conducted last month at Mr. Hastings's request." I kept my face blank, but my heart pounded not from anxiety but anticipation. Reeve continued. "The test confirms that Stephanie Hastings is the sole biological grandchild of Arthur Hastings." The silence was exquisite. My father blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. Ethan's smirk faltered, replaced by a rigid stillness. "What do you mean?" my mother finally said, her voice thin. "It means," Reeve said with deliberate precision, "that Mr. Ethan Hastings is not related by blood to Arthur Hastings. As such, per the terms of the will, the entire estate including the Charleston mansion, valued at $18 million, and all associated assets legally passes to Stephanie Hastings. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan leaned forward, his voice tight with disbelief. This is absurd. I've been part of this family all my life. You've been in this family, I said softly, but you were never of it. My mother's eyes snapped to me, full of venom. You manipulated this. You've been planning. Yes, I said, letting the word cut cleanly through her accusation. I've been planning for a long time. I knew one day the truth would matter. And now it does. Reeves' voice broke the tension. The transfer of assets will begin immediately. If there are any objections, they can be taken up in court, though I must warn you the DNA results are legally binding. I rose from my chair, smoothed the sleeves of my black blazer, and looked each of them in the eye. You thought destroying my work would destroy me. You thought loyalty was measured in obedience, in bowing to your favoritism, but you were wrong. I don't just survive attacks, I make them part of my arsenal. With that, I turned and walked out, the sound of my heels echoing in the polished hallway. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice break into a furious tirade, Ethan muttering curses under his breath, my father trying to regain control of the room, but none of it mattered. Because the moment I stepped outside into the bright Savannah sun, I knew exactly what my next move would be. They had underestimated me for the last time, and I was going to make them regret it every single day for the rest of their lives. The estate was mine, legally, uncontested by anyone with actual standing. But the moment those words left the lawyer's mouth, I knew the fight was far from over. People like my mother and Ethan didn't surrender. They clawed, schemed, and poisoned from the shadows. And I had every intention of meeting them on the battlefield they'd chosen, only I would be the one writing the rules. The mansion in Charleston was worth $18 million by conservative estimates, though to me its value lay in the power it symbolized. I had walked its marble halls as a child, always under the watchful eye of a mother who made sure I understood the hierarchy. Arthur Hastings's money belonged to the family, and family meant Ethan. The oak-lined driveway seemed to go on forever, ending at those grand white-pillared steps I'd once been told were not for you to claim. Now, they were mine. I moved in within the week, signing the transfer papers with the same pen my grandfather had once used to close business deals in Spain and Italy. In the study, I found his old steel briefcase still locked and placed it on my desk. I didn't open it yet. It felt symbolic, like an unopened chapter of his legacy waiting for the right moment. The day after I moved in, I made sure the locks were changed. Not because I feared Ethan or my mother would barge in, they were too proud for that, but because I wanted them to know they couldn't. I paid the locksmith $2,300 in cash and tipped him heavily to keep his mouth shut about who now occupied the mansion. Ethan, predictably, made the first move. A letter arrived 3 days later, written on thick cream stationery and reeking of cologne. It was an invitation to discuss equitable distribution over dinner in Charleston. Equitable, in Ethan's language, meant, give me most of it or I'll make your life hell. I didn't even respond. Silence can be the sharpest blade. Instead, I called my attorney and instructed him to quietly pull Ethan's financials. This was where years of patience paid off. I'd been preparing for this moment for a long time, long before the DNA test, long before my mother's destruction of my lab. I had already cultivated connections in the right circles. Investigators who could dig into tax records without leaving a trail. Analysts who could trace offshore transfers, and a few less than legal contacts who could hack where paper trails didn't exist. It cost me $150,000 in investigative fees within the first month. But what we uncovered was worth every cent. Ethan's life was a house of cards, built on loans from private lenders who charged interest like vultures. He had accounts in the Cayman Islands and Gibraltar, some tied to shell companies that barely existed on paper. There were payments to questionable consultants in Miami, and a suspicious transfer of £220,000 from a defunct import-export firm in Naples. I knew exactly how to weaponize this. My first step was to make Ethan believe I was indifferent. I attended charity galas, art auctions, and wine tastings in Charleston. each time wearing something that screamed money and control. I let photographs of me in the mansion's grand ballroom, accidentally, appear on social media through mutual acquaintances. I wanted him to see me thriving in what he considered his home, knowing it was driving him insane. The second step was to quietly feed the right information to the right people. An anonymous tip to a federal financial crimes task force. A leak to a journalist in New York about a prominent Southern businessman engaged in offshore laundering. I never mentioned Ethan's name directly. I didn't have to. The trail of evidence we'd found was enough to put a spotlight on him. Meanwhile, my mother tried a different tactic. She called me late one night, her voice thick with false warmth. "Stephanie, darling," she began, "we've all made mistakes. Family is family, after all. Ethan is, well, he's struggling. Surely you don't want to see your own brother."
Half-brother, I cut in. Actually, not even that.
She sighed dramatically, as though I were the unreasonable one. "This is about more than bloodlines. You've been given a gift, and with it comes responsibility." "Yes," I said. "The responsibility to protect what's mine from people who try to destroy me? I take that very seriously." There was a pause. "You've changed," she said finally. "No," I replied. "You just never knew who I really was." And then I hung up. By the end of the month, the first cracks appeared in Ethan's facade. His name surfaced in an investigative report about money laundering tied to Caribbean shell companies. He denied everything, of course, but the rumors stuck. His credit lines began to tighten. A real estate deal he was counting on fell through when a bank pulled financing. And through it all, I remained silent, never once acknowledging my hand in any of it. But revenge isn't just about destruction, it's about precision. I didn't want Ethan merely broke. I wanted him humiliated. So I invited him through the family layer to a business discussion at the Charleston mansion. He arrived in a tailored navy suit, clearly hoping to intimidate me. I greeted him in the grand foyer, wearing a deep crimson dress power and warning in one shade, and led him to the study. On the desk sat my grandfather's steel briefcase, now unlocked. Inside were neatly organized ledgers, personal notes, and signed contracts from Arthur's last years. Ethan glanced at them, confused. "This," I said, tapping the papers, "is what real business looks like. Transparent, accountable, profitable, everything you're not." He smirked. "You think you're untouchable now, just because of a piece of paper and a dead man's will?" "I don't think it," I said, leaning forward. "I know it. And I also know that by the time the feds are done with you, you'll wish you'd never stepped foot in this house." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there.
He left soon after, his pride too wounded to stay.
That night, I stood alone in the study, glass of Italian red in hand, staring out at the moonlit gardens. The war had only just begun, but already I was winning. Not because I had the mansion or the money, those were just tools, but because I had taken back control. In the months ahead, I would tighten the noose around Ethan's finances, dismantle my mother's social standing, and ensure that every door they tried to open slammed shut in their faces. They had taught me aggression by example. Now I was simply returning the lesson with interest. And I had no intention of stopping until they were left with nothing but the memory of what they'd lost. By the time the second month passed, the Charleston mansion felt less like an inheritance and more like a command center. Every night, I would sit in the grand study, my grandfather's study, surrounded by mahogany shelves and the scent of old leather, sipping a glass of deep Spanish red wine. It was one of the few gifts Arthur Hastings had ever given me directly, and now it tasted like victory in liquid form. Ethan had filed a formal challenge to the will, claiming undue influence and procedural errors in the execution. It was a desperate move, a flimsy attempt to claw back what the law had already taken from him. My attorney, Diane Keller, reviewed his petition with a smirk before sliding it across my desk. "He doesn't have a case," she said. "But he's hoping to drag you into months of court battles to drain your time and money." "Then let's make sure he regrets every hour of it," I replied. The following week, my mother showed up without warning. I had the locks changed weeks ago, but she found her way in through charm and manipulation, convincing one of the cleaning staff to let her in just for a few minutes. I found her in the sunroom, standing among the potted palms like she belonged there. "Stephanie," she began, her tone dripping with a sugary sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I think we can fix this. Ethan and I have talked, and we feel the best solution is." I held up my hand. "Stop, I already know what you feel. You feel entitled to something you didn't earn. You feel angry that the law didn't bend to your will. And you feel threatened because for the first time in your life, you have no power over me." Her mouth twitched, but she tried to maintain composure. "This isn't about power. This is about fairness." Fairness. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to the same icy tone I'd used in the lab when she shredded my research. "You shredded 12 years of my work because you wanted to punish me. You called that love. You called that family. You don't get to lecture me on fairness." She flinched, just enough for me to see it, then turned on her heel and left without another word. That night, I decided passive defense wasn't enough. I wanted blood figuratively, of course, but still enough to leave scars that never healed. I called Diane and gave her full authorization to dig deeper into Ethan's finances. I didn't care how much it cost. By the end of the investigation, I wanted to know every illegal dollar he'd ever touched. 3 weeks later, the results came in. Ethan's offshore accounts were a gold mine of incriminating transactions. Transfers to companies in Gibraltar that existed only on paper. Payments routed through the Cayman Islands to avoid federal scrutiny. Private loans from investors with names that screamed organized crime. There were even luxury purchases, cars, jewelry, and property in Miami bought through shell corporations. "It's enough to bury him," Diane said, sliding the thick report across my desk. "Then let's start digging the grave," I said. I took the file, made several copies, and began distributing them strategically. One went anonymously to the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. Another to a contact I had in the U.S. Attorney's Office. A third landed in the inbox of a local investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing high society corruption. I didn't attach my name to any of it. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation I could make. Ethan must have sensed the walls closing in because he made a pathetic attempt at reconciliation. He called me one evening, his voice tight but pretending to be cordial. "Stephanie, listen," he began. "This fight is bad for all of us. If we could just split the estate." "No," I said. "Think about it. You keep the house, I take the liquid assets." "No." His voice sharpened. "You're making a mistake." "Ethan," I said, calm as a blade sliding into its sheath, "the mistake was underestimating me." And then I hung up. 2 weeks later, the storm hit. Federal agents arrived at his penthouse in Atlanta early one morning with a warrant. They seized his computers, documents, and even one of his prized Italian sports cars. The news broke by noon, complete with a photo of him in handcuffs, looking like a man who just realized the life he'd built was about to collapse. I stood on the front balcony of the Charleston mansion that night, watching the sun sink behind the trees as the last light painted the sky blood red. In my hand, another glass of Spanish wine. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of crickets, the world carrying on as if nothing had happened, because in the grand scheme of things, nothing had except the slow and inevitable destruction of my enemies. But for me, it was everything. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Ethan was just the first domino. My mother was next, and her downfall would be slower, more deliberate. I didn't just want her humiliated, I wanted her erased from the social circles she clung to like oxygen. That meant pulling strings in the right places. The country clubs, the charity boards, the art galleries. I knew exactly how to do it because I'd watched her play that game my entire life. But for now, I let myself enjoy the first real taste of victory. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace, not because I'd forgiven them, but because I'd proven that forgiveness wasn't necessary for closure. Sometimes closure is simply watching your enemies burn and knowing you lit the match. And the match was still in my hand. 6 months after the federal raid took Ethan down, the Charleston mansion no longer felt like an inherited prize. It had become the nerve center of everything I was building. I had transformed it into a private genetics research foundation, complete with 2 fully outfitted laboratories, a climate-controlled archive, and a glass-walled library filled with every text my mother once told me was too advanced for me to waste my time on. The labs gleamed with state-of-the-art equipment. Each microscope, centrifuge, and sequencing station wasn't just a tool, it was a monument. Every flashing LED was a silent reminder of the day she shredded my life's work, and the day I decided her downfall would be my life's mission. I didn't just rebuild my research. I expanded it, hiring a team of the brightest geneticists in the country, people who understood ambition, precision, and loyalty. I paid them well $250,000 salaries for the leads, no questions asked, because money buys silence and silence buys control. From the moment Ethan was booked in Florida, the media had been relentless. His trial was set for the fall, and every new leak from the prosecution chipped away at whatever reputation he'd clung to. I made sure those leaks found their way into the right hands. Photographs of him being escorted in chains, details about luxury purchases through offshore laundering, each piece was another nail in his social coffin. But Ethan was just the warm-up. My real finale was reserved for my mother. She still lived in Savannah, but not in the grand house she once ruled like a queen. That had been sold to cover Ethan's legal defense fees before his accounts were frozen. She was now tucked into a modest colonial-style home on a quiet street small enough that the driveway couldn't even fit the Jaguar she used to flaunt. The accounts she depended on were dwindling fast, and I had every intention of accelerating their demise. The first strike came through the social circuit. My mother thrived on image, her position on charity boards, her invitations to art openings, the way she worked every room with a drink in one hand and a whisper in the other. I used that weakness like a scalpel. Quietly, I began donating to the same charities she sat on, but with far larger sums. And I didn't just sign my name. I arranged events at the Charleston mansion, making sure the local press covered each one. Soon, every gala, every fundraiser, every museum unveiling had my name in the headline and hers buried if mentioned at all. Then came the whispers. Savannah's high society runs on gossip like blood through veins, and I was more than happy to supply it. Through intermediaries, I let slip carefully chosen stories, rumors about her financial struggles, hints that she'd been involved in questionable dealings with Ethan's offshore accounts, suggestions that her influence was not what it used to be. No direct accusations. Just enough smoke for everyone to start believing there was fire. She fought back, of course. She tried to rally her old allies, tried to charm her way back into relevance. But every door she knocked on was one I'd already closed. Her name began disappearing from invitation lists. A few friends stopped returning her calls. And when one charity board quietly voted her out, citing a shift in direction, I knew the final phase had begun. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. My presence in her world was now so large she couldn't enter a room without feeling it. Every time she saw my name in the society pages, every time she heard my voice mentioned at a luncheon she wasn't invited to, it was a reminder that I had taken everything she valued. Still, I wanted one final touch, something personal. So I wrote her a letter, one sentence in my handwriting. You taught me to fight for what's mine, thank you. No return address, no signature beyond my name. I knew she'd recognize the script. I mailed it in an ivory envelope, the kind used for wedding invitations, because I wanted her to open it expecting something else, something hopeful, before the sting set in. A week later, a contact in Savannah told me she'd been seen leaving her house in tears. I didn't feel pity. Pity was for people who didn't try to destroy you. As for Ethan, I kept him in my sights. Every few months I made a point of visiting Florida. Sometimes for research conferences, sometimes just for a weekend by the coast. Each trip, I sent him a postcard. Not of American beaches, but of Italian coastal villages, places he'd bragged about visiting in his business days. On the back I wrote the same 4 words every time. From the rightful heir. I knew the postcards would taunt him. I knew he'd recognize them as my signature brand of aggression, not loud, not messy, but calculated and inescapable. A constant reminder that I'd not only taken what he thought was his, but that I was thriving in the process. In America, power comes from 3 things: money, property, and the will to burn every bridge necessary. My mother and Ethan had tried to take all 3 from me, but in the end I stood with every one of them in my grasp. The Charleston mansion wasn't just an inheritance. It was proof that I could survive their worst and come back stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous. Sometimes I walked the marble halls at night, the silence of the house wrapping around me like armor. I'd stop in the study, pour a glass of wine, and look at the old steel briefcase on the desk, the one that had belonged to my grandfather. I had long since opened it, read every note, studied every ledger. Inside, I found not just his business mind, but his philosophy. Power isn't taken. It's built. I understood that now. My revenge hadn't been one act. It had been a construction project, brick by brick, until my enemies were trapped outside, looking in. And I wasn't done building. For all their schemes, all their aggression toward me, they had made one fatal mistake. They taught me how to fight, but they never imagined I'd be the one to win. And when I did,